In the literature of all nations, difficulty is experienced in drawing a line of demarcation between pure folklore stories and the genuine historical records. Just as people from the beginning of time have sought an explanation of the facts of nature and have experienced the fear of the unknown and the desire for help and guidance, so there has been a universal tendency to add a gloss of the marvelous to the traditional stories handed down. Side by side with records of historic facts, there have existed many religious and other beliefs, as well as a maze of traditional stories, some of which are very difficult to understand. A strange tradition of this coast is the dim legend of the winged people, Te Iwi Itere, the people who flew. These folk were associated with Waitotara and are referred to in certain old sayings and songs. They had no fixed homes, but flew from place to place until a woman of their race, Tarapu Whenua, caused them to live in pars. Possibly this is a survival from Indonesia, or from still further to the westward, and eventually became localized at Waitotara. At various points on the coast of Taranaki lived Tanawas, and their lairs, Rua Tanawa, are still known. Unlike certain huge dragons slain by the heroes of old, some of these Taranaki Tanawas were quite small, being about 2 feet in length with spikes all over them. 12 such Tanawas used to come at the call of a certain Tohunga to assist his canoe in its passage through the breakers, 6 of them swimming on either side of the canoe until the breakers were safely passed. Weird tales of the Mairo, or wild men, the tree dwellers on the slopes of the mountain Taranaki, now called Mount Egmont, and of the Patapaiarehe, the fairy folk, may be partly folklore and partly records of the survivors of the earlier inhabitants of Taranaki, the Tanata Whenua. A very strange story is that of the coming of the sands to our coast, perhaps the strangest of all strange stories. But interest is added to this particular tradition by the fact that lengthy and unique incantations have been preserved by the tribes in connection with it. One story has its origin in the mists of antiquity and then enters into the realm of actual historical fact. Te Aotearoa is one of the most sacred and venerated possessions of the Maori people. From the misty past comes the mana atua, the godlike power of this illustrious axe. It is steeped in the mysterious lore of the days long gone. The age of Te Aotearoa cannot be exactly stated, but it was old when the intrepid voyagers of 1350 brought it to these shores. The name means the encircler of heaven. Te Aotearoa still exists today. Far back in the night of time, before Iratanata human life was in this world, heaven and earth were not separated. Certain of the Whanau Rangi, the children of Rangi and Papa, separated the Sky Father and the Earth Mother in order that the world of light, the Ao Marama, might be achieved. Tane cut the arms of the embracing parents with Te Aotearoa. When the sky was forced upwards, Tane was named Tane Tokorangi, Tane who propped up the heavens. From Tane Tokorangi, the thrice tapu axe was passed down from elder son to elder son until at length Rakau Maui held it. Rakau Maui gave the axe to his great-grandson Turi, who was destined to be the principal chief on board the great canoe out there on its memorable voyage to New Zealand in the middle of the 14th century. Turi brought Te Aotearoa with him in the Aotea canoe from Hawaiki Rangiatea to Aotearoa. Hawaiki Rangiatea was an island approximately 125 miles west of Taranaki. Certain of the Whanau Rangi, the children of Rangi and Papa, separated the Sky Father and the Earth Mother in order that the world of light, the Ao Marama, might be achieved. Tane cut the arms of the embracing parents with Te Aotearoa. When the sky was forced upwards, Tane was named Tane Tokorangi, Tane who propped up the heavens. From Tane Tokorangi, the thrice tapu axe was passed down from elder son to elder son until at length Rakau Maui held it. Rakau Maui gave the axe to his great-grandson Turi, who was destined to be the principal chief on board the great canoe out there on its memorable voyage to New Zealand in the middle of the 14th century. Turi brought Te Aotearoa with him in the Aotea canoe from Hawaiki Rangiatea to Aotearoa. Hawaiki Rangiatea was an island approximately 125 miles west. Turi brought Te Aotearoa with him in the Aotea canoe from Hawaiki Rangiatea to Aotearoa. Hawaiki Rangiatea was an island approximately 125 miles west-northwest of Tahiti. When the Aotea encountered a great storm and was in grave danger of sinking, it was on the great axe that Turi called in his incantation to withdraw the canoe from the depths. In the new land, after Turi and his people had settled at Patia, Te Ahuarangi was passed on from generation to generation until the axe came to the hands of Rangi.
But as the Great War drew to a close in 1918, there came renewed interest in New Zealand's own wars, and supporters lobbied for a history of these to be commissioned by the government before the last survivors, the last veterans passed away. And in 1918, the government finally agreed, and James Cowan, a bilingual journalist, who'd actually grown up on a farm that included part of the Ōrākau battle site, was commissioned to write this. And his two-volume work comes out in 1922 and 1923, and it's invaluable in many ways because of its extensive use of oral sources. He spoke to hundreds and hundreds of Māori and Pākehā veterans of these wars. And it came really to be seen as a definitive history of the New Zealand Wars for decades thereafter. But it was really devoid of any critical analysis and interpretation, and in this way it didn't really constitute any kind of threat to this emergent narrative, this emergent myth of Ōrākau. If anything, the success of his book, and which itself had an emphasis on the mutual respect of former adversaries forged through ordeal by battle, that just reinforces that notion, reinforces the myth of these wars as romantic and chivalrous affairs that led to the greatest race relations in the world. And Cowan's work inspires other attempts to remember this history, or maybe to misremember it. And Pākehā flock in their thousands to Rewi Rudolf Hayward's 1925 silent movie, Rewi's Last Stand, and in 1940 that's remade as a popular feature-length talkie. And that later film is showing to generations of school children through the school film library service. So that kind of influences the way that people understand this conflict. So that myth becomes the way that people engage with that history and the way that they understand it. And these kind of ideas become deeply embedded in Pākehā culture and endure across a lot of the 20th century. So the centenary of the Ōrākau battle is marked in 1964, and guests are treated to a special screening of Rewi's Last Stand, of course, the definitive sort of account that many people, of the way they understand this history. There's a hangi, a kapa haka competition, and a concert featuring a very young Kiri Te Karawa. Yet the interesting thing is some Waikato elders want no part in these proceedings, and they're concerned that the whole affair had become something of a circus. And so long as Pākehā continued to use these war anniversaries as an excuse to pat themselves on the back for how wonderfully they treated their natives, you know, that was kind of understandable that Māori didn't want any part of this. The Pākehā narrative of the Waikato War was out of sync with the still largely ignored Māori story of an unjustified invasion of their homeland, followed by numerous and senseless killings, confiscations, exile and poverty. And that just wasn't the dominant narrative for most of the 20th century. Yet thanks to a new generation of Māori voices in the 1970s, Ngā Tamatoa and others, that Pākehā version of the wars is becoming harder to sustain, and it's all but discredited really by the 1970s. And the problem really is that no new narrative emerges of the wars, or none that the majority of Pākehā are willing to accept or willing to hear. So really the dominant attitude is don't talk about the wars, don't mention these, we don't want to hear about it, we don't want to hear this uncomfortable history, it's not who we are. We grew up as a people learning that we had the greatest race relations in the world, and these stories are disrupting that myth, that narrative.
And the scientific method became a new way of seeing the world. But like all traditions, that wonderful, enlightened new approach also built around itself its own almost quasi-religious aura. That if the method was objective, then so must be the people implementing the method. And that, of course, is not necessarily the case. The notion of a warrior gene as a scientific fact is actually based on the history of a scientific and cultural lie, and that is the notion of a warrior race. The warrior race suggests that there are certain races of people who were born to fight, to be violent, and to kill. It was described most graphically, I think, by one of the first English writers about our country who had never actually visited here, but in 1830 wrote that the land is inhabited by savage, bloody warrior race, by a savage, bloody warrior race, where vengeance and war is the precious lifeblood of an ancestor bequeathed from savage father to savage son. Where did that image come from? Where did the novelist Alan Duff get the idea of naming his novel Once Were Warriors, when a clear and actually objective analysis of our society would have shown that the book could more properly have been called Once Were Gardeners, Once Were Poets, Once Were Singers, and if you're from Kahungunu, Once and Always Were Lovers. So where did the idea come from? When a man called Christopher Columbus set sail for India to find the quickest route to the lucrative spice markets in India, he ended up in the Caribbean. He found no spice, he found no gold, no diamonds. And so he returned to Europe empty-handed, except for a few indigenous peoples whom he had captured and took back to Spain to sell as slaves. But knowing that his life and his future adventures may be at risk, because he came back empty-handed, he did what all entrepreneurs do in that situation, I think. He lied. He said he couldn't quite reach it, but there was actually a place called El Dorado. And Dor, of course, is the Spanish word for gold, so El Dorado was a city of gold. Other countries heard about this El Dorado, and they funded adventurers to find it as well. One of them was an Englishman called Sir Walter Raleigh. He set off to find El Dorado, and he was basically given an ultimatum by Queen, and the scientific method became a new way of seeing the world. But like all traditions, that wonderful, enlightened new approach also built around itself its own almost quasi-religious aura. That if the method was objective, then so must be the people implementing the method. And that, of course, is not necessarily the case. The notion of a warrior gene as a scientific fact is actually based on the history of a scientific and cultural lie. And that is the notion of a warrior race.
You, Mr. Arab.
Okay, Rabbit, I got a bead on you.